did some other interview where someone asked me about The Last of Us and would there be any more stories or something. And I mentioned, like, we have written a story that takes place after Last of Us 2 that stars Tommy. And I hope one day we get to make it. And the headlines across the industry were like, Naughty Dog has outlined Last of Us Part 3. And that's actually wrong. It was always a small story. It was never like a full title. At the time, we had higher priorities at Naughty Dog, was like to fix our pipeline, to fix work-life balance issues. Just based on where we were, I didn't want to prioritize this story, so that story was shelved. And I still believe one day it will see the light.
So they were gonna make a Tommy DLC perhaps? Because when we look back, I realized that The Last of Us Part 2 never actually got a DLC. Whereas like Part 1, got left behind, which focuses on Ellie's early days and when she was with her friend Riley. And I always wondered why, like what they could have done if they made a Last of Us Part 2 DLC. And I definitely would have loved to have seen a DLC centered around Tommy. Perhaps it would be, if they did do a DLC focused on Tommy, it would have been really cool to see potentially them focus on what happened when Tommy went back after The Last of Us Part 1, when he went back to the settlement. What happened then? What happened during that time when Joel comes back? Like what his life looked like. It would have been really cool to see something like that. Their time in the settlement, Tommy, Joel, Ellie. But I feel like if Ellie and Joel were a part of that DLC and kind of this like in between Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2, I feel like people would have been more curious to see the relationship between Joel and Ellie versus Tommy. So I think if a Tommy DLC were to happen and it were to actually work, I think they probably would have best benefited from doing a Tommy and Joel story. And I would have loved to have seen a Tommy and Joel story that focused primarily around what they did before The Last of Us Part 1. Because you knew that, through Joel's dialogue that he had frequently with Ellie, and he wasn't really one to share and divulge pieces of his past, but there was a conversation that they had when they're going down a hallway, and you hear Ellie asks why he knows so much about these runners that they're these looters that they were encountering in I think it was Pittsburgh. And he said that he used to run with a crew like that, and I believe Tommy was a part of that crew before they ever, after obviously after Joel's daughter died, he obviously got in with a bad group of apples and was doing some stuff that he wasn't proud of. And I think it would have been cool and shed a lot of light on Joel if they had done a game centered around Tommy and Joel's kind of band of brothers type deal. You know what I'm saying? Like a Thor and Loki kind of situation is the first thing that comes to mind. These two brothers that, are thick as thieves, and, what their life was like. That would have been really cool. Provides more backstory on Tommy, provides more backstory on Joel. And if they didn't do that, that's obviously them going into the past. But if they didn't do that and they decided to focus specifically on Last of Us Part 2, I would love to know what Tommy was doing, just a brief epilogue centered around what Tommy does after, The Last of Us Part 2, where we see Ellie leave Tommy. Obviously at the end of that, towards the end of the game, we see Ellie and Tommy have a pretty tumultuous conversation because Tommy wants, Ellie to go back, wants to, pick up the trail and go back after Abby. And obviously at the time, Ellie declines. But I would love to have known what Tommy did during that time. Does he decide to try to track down Abby and find himself in the middle of some other situation that forces a come to Jesus moment for him, where he has to kind of force his own, his own demons and his own kind of where he feels like he's had his shortcomings and his missteps as a brother, and maybe have that transcend into flashbacks, where in these moments he has flashbacks to when he was running with Joel and they were running with the gang and doing some pretty not so great stuff. And that would be a great way to incorporate the, some past flashbacks and things like that. That provides not only more context to Joel as a character, which I think a lot of people would want to know, just to provide a bit more closure to that character, but it would also provide a bit more of a conclusionary tale, the story of Tommy. I think that would be really cool. That's honestly what I would want to see. And I think them going into kind of an epilogue point would have been really strong for the character of Tommy, who in The Last of Us Part 2, we don't really see too much of him. We see a little bit of Tommy at the beginning of the game when he's kind of, trying to convince Ellie not to go on this revenge kick. And then we also see a little bit of Tommy at the end, and a little bit in the middle. But and if they didn't decide to go that route, it would be cool to see what Tommy was doing when he was chasing the tail of Abby, because we follow it through the lens of Ellie through much of it, and then Ellie and Tommy kind of collapse on each other later in the, when he takes out one of Abby's close friends. And yeah, I would have loved to have seen what Tommy was getting into when he was tracking down tracking down Abby. That would have been cool. But those are obviously my three. Those would be my three wishes of what I would love to have seen in a Last of Us kind of DLC centered around Tommy.
Light of day.